some of the plans in Anchorage now are to really focus on high tech in the aerospace industry, or to lean in on renewable energy. Like some of those things where you say like, okay, these are our assets or these are opportunities that we have. How do we either craft policy or put funding toward, or really, just help the private sector move in that direction?
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. Community planners wear many hats and have to be experts on a lot of issues. Today we talk with one, Anna Brawley, who for over the last decade has been with the Anchorage consulting firm Agnew Beck. We discuss her family, her education, and her efforts to make Anchorage a better place to live, specifically her work on alcohol policy, housing, and homelessness. Anna Brawley, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Andrew. Happy to be here.
So we've been talking about doing this for some time. I've known you for over a year, basically by seeing you at assembly meetings. You're very involved in municipal issues. And so I'm super grateful that you're here today.
Yeah, thanks. It's nice to have a chat.
Yeah, I want to learn more about you. So to our listeners. So you are from Ohio.
Yeah, I'm from Columbus, Ohio. That's where I was born. My family moved away and back a couple times, so I actually was born there, graduated high school there, but also lived for a few months in Phoenix, Arizona as a baby, and then a few years up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in a town called Iron Mountain. So do you kind of consider, is that Midwest? Definitely Midwest.
Okay, so you feel like a Midwesterner.
Yeah.
Are you from an immigrant family?
So all sides of my family are immigrants, and it's sort of an interesting spread across the board, and it really shows how, over the generations you get, assimilated into just being generic American, and for me, I just consider myself essentially a, white female American. My grandmother on my mom's side is half Serbian and half Filipino, and so her parents met. My grandfather was a Filipino lawyer working in East Chicago, met my great-grandmother, who was I can't remember if she immigrated from Serbia or if she was already, I believe she did as a young adult. And then they met, got married, moved out to Seattle. My grandmother was born there. And then shortly after that, they separated. And so my Filipino side, it's interesting because I've never really engaged with it much. I always knew that was true. For a long time, my grandmother didn't really talk about her background. And I think, especially growing up during World War II, she looks Filipino or could be mistaken for Japanese. So I've always wondered, did she experience any prejudice or just the fact that she looked physically different a little bit than than her mother, my great-grandmother.
What happened with your great-grandma and him? Like, what they didn't stay together, or what happened there? Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, I think, I guess I've never heard that story through my family. I know that they separated pretty soon after my grandmother was born. The one little bit that I do know is later in life, my great-grandfather did try to connect with my grandmother. So she met him when she was a young adult, because I don't know that he ever lived in Indiana again, but he had come back there. And then he also, my mother actually, she's the oldest of 5 kids in that family. She met with him as well when I think she was in college, maybe. So just having lunch, not in-depth interactions. And so, but I think it was probably my great-grandfather trying to connect back in. And my grandma actually this summer told me this story where she vaguely remembers, and I think it was in the Chicago area, going to some event and then people saying, "Oh, there's Juana Yamo's daughter," and he was very proud of her, and he was presenting her to whoever those other adults were. I'm guessing probably other colleagues. So as far as we know, there isn't another. He didn't start another family. He clearly maintained some kind of connection. I don't know if it was his choice that Keki left or not. If it was mutual. But yeah, there was still something there, certainly.
So. I guess the present day, or closer to the present day, you grew up with one sibling, or?
Yeah, so I have a sister, and so my sister's transgender. So growing up, I had a little brother. Essentially, we're 5 years apart, almost 5 years, and her name is Eileen Galvin. And I don't know. I know there's the whole thing about not saying somebody's dead name, so I don't know if she would prefer me not to do that, but yeah, and so she. So we grew up together.
Just the two of you?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just have the one sibling and then my parents. Mm-hmm. And she well, originally she came out as a gay man or gay boy in high school. So after I had graduated.
And what town were y'all in Ohio?
We were or my parents still live in the suburb of Hilliard, Ohio. So it's on the western side of Columbus.
I mean, I have some knowledge of politics in Ohio, but I would just say, like, I don't think of them as it being a very progressive place. Was this a very progressive city, town, high school? I mean, I guess, how was it for your sister?
For my sister, that would actually be interesting to ask her more, because growing up, I mean, she came out as gay in, I think, her senior year of high school. So it's pretty late. But it was funny before that, though. I remember, it wasn't a surprise to me, I guess, because I remember growing up, for example, she's a performer. I'm much more in the background. She's out front, total ham on stage. Like, she loves doing that. Mm-hmm. In fact, now she does burlesque, so very much out there on stage. And so she would always dress up as the various, like, Disney characters, for example. And she has a really good memory, and so she could recite entire scenes from these movies. And I'm saying, like, a 6-year-old, just right. Like doing, like, verbatim, like, same voice tone, all those things. And so not to conflate, performance with your sexuality, but I mean, she was always just kind of like what you would, I guess, call like the fabulous, for lack of a better word. Like, that's just her whole personality, right?
Were your parents accepting from the beginning, or did they have an evolution?
I think yes and no. I think first, I think they didn't have any ideological opposition. So luckily, we didn't grow up in a family where it was, that's a sin or you're going to hell, or that wasn't the vibe. It certainly, I think, took a while for my parents to adjust, but it's an interesting adjustment because, like I say, I grew up with a little brother, and Eileen is still the same person she's always been, right? Regardless of her name or what she has on her driver's license now. But to me, it's and I'm guessing my parents went through this even more so than I did, is that idea of changing, like, the identity that you have in your head of them, so changing from I have a brother to I have a sister.
So you mentioned that you went to University of Chicago in 2006, mm-hmm. and that's where you got your first master's. I know you have two. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about the first one. So the first one was at University of Chicago, mm-hmm. Social sciences.
Yeah.
What did you study?
Well, so all through undergrad, so I studied history, and through undergrad and then going into grad school, I thought, I want to be a history professor. I want to study the First World War and the British soldiers' experience and trauma for the rest of my life. Like that. So because I can dive real deep on really specific topics. And so that's what I did. And so I was pursuing this 1-year master's degree at University of Chicago, thinking, okay, that'll be the stepping stone to my PhD. And that was a common thing, actually, for people to do that degree and then to figure out what they want to do for their dissertation. So that was the track I was on. And then living in Chicago would have been 2007, 2008, decided academia is not for me, especially the humanities. It's challenging. I mean, the issues of getting tenure. 3 things changed the trajectory of what I was going to do. One was this terrible commute that I had. So I actually lived in the city of Chicago, and then drove out to the suburbs for my job. And I hate long commutes. Like, I probably listened to, I don't know how many audiobooks, because it's 45 minutes one way in the morning, usually an hour just because of traffic on the way home, if you're lucky. And so I just knew, like, this is not, like, I would get home and just have no energy and I need to do something different. That was the first thing. Second thing was that it was in Chicago, the 100th anniversary of the Burnham Plan, the centennial. So the Burnham Plan was a city plan for Chicago. 1909 is when it was passed. So this is like the couple years that I lived there. And it was really, well, the Burnham Plan was after the Chicago fire in the 1870s. It was really this ambitious plan to redesign the downtown of the city, get rid of all the wooden boardwalks, most of which had burned down. I mean, if you look at the Chicago fire, it burned most of downtown and it was all made of wood. So all gone. And then also just wanting to be a modern city. It was what was called the City Beautiful movement. So, designers in America would look at Paris. That's the folks like Frederick Law Olmsted, who did Central Park and a lot of the other beautiful park, like all these kind of like really beautiful city design. San Francisco too is another Burnham design city. So it was that era of city making. The third thing was, and again, I had not been involved in politics at all, but it was just in the background, it was the essentially the rise of and then the first election of Barack Obama. And so University of Chicago is in Hyde Park, which is on the south side of Chicago. That's where his house is. I wish I had thought to walk by his house before it was locked down until the end of time by Secret Service. And I have friends who, would play basketball, for example, so they would see him and David Axelrod just playing ball, in the neighborhood, right? This is like 2006, 2007. So early on in his, I think he had been elected as a state senator, and then right when his campaign was announced. And so that was a big deal.
You weren't involved in politics, but the night that he was elected president, you were where?
So I remember, it was, I don't know if you want to put this in the podcast or not, but I was laughing too, because if you remember, during the primary, it was Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton, I believe, is from the Chicago suburbs, like the north suburbs. She does not have the same level of identity with Chicago as Barack Obama does. Although, of course, he wasn't born there either. I'm sorry, he was born in Hawaii. Just making that clear that I'm not a birther. I'm just saying he was not born in the city of Chicago.
Right.
So I remember walking on Michigan Avenue. So that's the main drag. There's all these tourism shops, and there was, and so I would say there was a clear preference for Obama in Chicago, certainly. And I remember seeing this shirt, and it had his picture and Hillary's picture, and it said "Bros before hoes." And that was just in the tourism shop. So, I mean, that's what I'm talking about, the level of just, love for this man. And then it trickled down into the joke shirts, like the ones we see here in Alaska. Anyways, so
I was going to say, you don't want me to put that in the podcast.
Yeah, you can't. Yeah. I mean, I didn't buy the shirt. I just, I just feel like it's a great data point for where the city was at that point. So I remember, it was imminent. The vote was imminent, or election night was. It was pretty certain that he was going to win. I don't know that it was definite. I wasn't following. Again, I was not involved in any of this. But locals heard that you could basically sign up, like you could get a free ticket to go to Grant Park because they were going to have this big election night celebration. And it was one of those things like with concert tickets where you sit there and refresh. You know? And so I remember sitting at my desk at work like, come on. And so one of my coworkers and I both got tickets. And again, they were free, but it was just this limited system. So I remember walking in with my friend, and really, I mean, it was like being at a concert. Like I imagine it's what Woodstock looked like, or Lollapalooza minus all of the stages. It was just massive. So we were nowhere near the
stage.
Yeah, I mean, they were maybe like, half an inch tall at the most. And I remember thinking, and there was bulletproof glass up too, because remember at the time people were so worried that he would be assassinated just because of all of just everything. And so I remember that stuck in my head. But it was all clear. So I remember we were waiting, and then it was after 8 p.m. or whenever it was that the polls closed, and and it was pretty clear that it was going to be, a landslide or whatever you would call it. I don't remember what he said. I remember standing there because I have some pictures that I took, so I can visually think of it, but I don't remember what, I couldn't tell you what his speech was. But the thing that stuck in my head more than that, and really what again, the third thing of three that really led me to go into city planning was that I remember walking out afterwards, and you could just feel on the streets there was just this overwhelming like positivity and happiness and joy, and people selling T-shirts, like people playing music, like dudes banging on drum, like literally it was just, everybody was so overjoyed, and they were just flooding out in the streets, and it was maybe like midnight at that point. So I was trying to get back to my house. So I was going to the train. But it was just like this, all of this positive energy was overwhelming. Like even thinking about it is overwhelming. And that was really what I saw. Like, this is like just the hope. I mean, it was such a cliche, the hope, but I mean, that's what you could feel like in the streets, with every single person who was there. And so, yeah, it was just an amazing experience. And it wasn't at that point, the candidate, it wasn't so much that, it was really just all the people together. It was such a cool experience. We had to go through security and all these things, but I don't remember one bad incident. I don't remember hearing a bad incident. It was just, everybody was so excited to be there. It was such a moment. It was really, really cool.
So you got inspired to be a city planner. I'll just say on your, you gave me a resume to prepare for this interview, and it says Anna Brawley, AICP. I have never seen the 4 letters AICP. So what is AICP? So
that is the American Institute of Certified Planners. And I guess maybe this is a good place to say, what is a planner? Right. So I'd say planning. The most technical definition of planning is somebody who, usually works for the city or a city. You can certainly have other versions of planning. FEMA is planning. A lot of different things are planning, but it's essentially land use planning or comprehensive planning, city planning, urban planning. Those are all kind of synonyms for the same thing. Transportation planning is also in there. And it's essentially people who specialize in a technical sense, we'll specialize in things like zoning and land use. So what you're allowed to build on your property. With transportation, it's specializing in not so much it's not engineering. So it's not the physical design. You're not making the roads or the rails or whatever. You're really looking more at the built environment and the systems. And so, for example, a planner might look at, we need to fit 20,000 more housing units in our city. So we should put them near the bus lines. We should put them in places that we need to redevelop. We should put them in places where we don't have to build a bunch of new infrastructure. Or economic development is another type of planning. So thinking about, okay, we want to grow. It's really taking, this is a classic planner thing that we can't describe what we are, right? But it's really, I guess the way I think of it is understanding how different systems work. And so, in the traditional sense, that's these physical systems like land use, transportation, economic development. But in the broader sense, it's really thinking how do all these systems function and work together, or how are they not working? So for example, food insecurity, so you start thinking about food insecurity. So you're thinking in Alaska, okay, well, how much food are we growing in Alaska? So you're talking about agriculture, and you have to understand the economics of agriculture, the ways that you bring products to market, the issues of taxation, that because agriculture land, you have to have cheap taxes for that because otherwise the farmer can't make money, right? So there's all these pieces of kind of understanding different sectors of the economy and how they work and the things that they need to work. Another one is trying to think. I want to back up. Yeah. Just when so my understanding is that in Anchorage right now, there really isn't a place to say we're going to put 20,000 units of housing, so because somebody else owns it or it's not available, or so working within that. Teach me about 2022. I'm a planner and I want to do 20,000 units of housing in Anchorage. What does the planner do? Sure. So it is also challenging because a lot of planners work, they work within government, but they're not elected officials. They're not decision makers. And so a lot of the work is really providing expertise, looking at what other communities do, making recommendations, and then also implementing. So for example, code enforcement. So planners don't do code enforcement, but things like that, where it's, okay, we have this code on the book. But you know the code. Yeah. And you can give advice about what the code says you can and can't do. Yeah. And so, for example, in Anchorage, there's long-range planning, which is more what I'm talking about, where you write a plan. Mm-hmm. And I guess the piece that I didn't bring up, too, is there's community engagement. And so, in one sense, a planner has technical knowledge. In the other sense, you're really helping a community walk through a decision process to say what you want to be in the future. And so, for example, maybe you want to be the biggest tourism, maybe something like Denali Borough, for example, up where Healy, Cantwell, around Denali Park. One future, for example, that they could say is we really want to build up and be the biggest tourism community in the state. And I'm not saying that that's their plan, but that's something where you can imagine a long-term future, and then you start to think about what are the things we have to do now to get the city to look more like what we want 20 years from now. So whether we need to build more roads or with housing in a place like the Matsu, for example, lots of empty land. They really need access to the land. And so that's where you're saying, where should we put our roads? And maybe that's state roads, for example. Where should we invest and put these state roads, start subdividing land? Coordinating maybe if we're going to extend a sewer line, making sure that we're putting that in a place where there's going to be a subdivision in the future. I think things like that, kind of coordinating between these different systems. So for a planner in 2022, thinking about where to put housing, it's really just understanding. I guess one good metaphor of planning, and this is not my metaphor, it's been around for a while, is that you're a boat on a river. So your city is a boat, or your community. I shouldn't just say city because it applies for any community. And you're moving down the river. So that's not going to change, right? You're not going to stop the river. You're not going to dam it up. You're just this, that's the flow of change. And the Buddhist version of the flow of change is that you just, you acceptance, right? That you just let the river flow. Planners are more control freaks a little bit. So we think more about, okay, if we're moving down the river, one, we want to avoid hazards. We want to avoid rocks. And so, something where, you just let your city spiral, like your schools get bad, or somewhere like Detroit, for example. I mean, Detroit is certainly has a lot of challenges. It's coming back and it's really revitalizing itself in a lot of ways. But the trajectory that it was on was people were leaving, right? People with money were moving out of the city, moving to the suburbs.
Planners failed.
Yeah. Well, I'd say that it's hard to give too much agency to planners because they tend to recommend things that people may or may not pick up on. But yeah, but it is that incremental change, right? So you're saying, okay, we have these problems we need to fix. Or another one in a lot of communities right now is short-term rentals, right? So that's just something that that's what the market's doing. Mm-hmm. And you as a planner are not going to stop that from happening, but you can think about how do we maybe tweak the market, or how do we incentivize what we want? How do we disincentivize what we don't want? Those kinds of things.
Avoiding the rocks.
Yeah. So you avoid the hazards, and then you're really kind of steering in the direction that you want to go. So again, if you want to, like some of the plans in Anchorage now are to really focus on high tech in the aerospace industry, or to lean in on renewable energy. Like some of those things where you say like, okay, these are our assets, or these are opportunities that we have. How do we either craft policy or put funding toward, or really, just help the private sector move in that direction? And so planning is really kind of just nudging that boat in a direction that you want. And it's not because you're going to be able to control it, but you can at least, you're trained to think long term and to be able to look ahead, as opposed to being focused on, for example, zoning code implementation. There's the current planning version of that is really, okay, if someone needs to build something, what are they allowed to build? What rules do they need to follow? Is there anything about their property that they need a variance, meaning they can't enforce those rules, so they need to change? That's kind of the current planning model. The long range planning model is that thinking ahead of like, okay, let's think big picture. Let's talk goals. Let's talk vision. Let's have a bunch of objectives. And another model of that in Alaska is the economic development. So the comprehensive economic development strategies are a form of plan. So they're not called they're a plan, but they're basically, how do we nudge the economy toward what we want? How do we invest more in workforce? How do we, like, those kinds of things? And so a lot of what you end up producing is a plan, with your goals, your strategies. And then the idea is not that there's one person doing those things, or even just that the city is doing those things, or the state, but it's really, how do we work together to make that happen?
So that's what planner is, that brief explanation.
Yeah.
And you decided that's what you wanted to do. So you went to Cornell and you got a master's degree in planning.
Yeah. MRP, regional planning, whatever that means.
How'd you end up in Alaska?
So one of the alumni from my program, we didn't overlap. We were there at different years, but they were working at the company that I work for now, Agnew Beck Consulting, and so it was. Spring of 2011. It was the depth of the recession. Well, that recession. And it was especially for entry-level jobs, public sector, private sector, there was not a lot because a lot of people had not. It was kind of before the big retirement wave. Anyway, it was hard to find a job. And so we were all looking around. There were 50 of us in my class, my cohort. And so I was looking around for a job. I found a job posting for Agnew Beck, and then the contact happened to be the person who who also had gone to Cornell because I found their resume. And so it was interesting because I really just contacted for an informational interview. And then it turned into, oh, you should apply for this job. And then literally sight unseen, we did our interview by phone. It was even before Zoom. So I remember pacing in my grad student housing, on the phone for my phone interview. And then that was April. I got the job and then moved up here in July after I finished my degree.
I guess one of your first projects at Agnew Beck was alcohol policy, and you've kind of worked on that continuously until very recently.
Yeah, so that was a one-day meeting in May of 2012. And then 10 years later, in May of 2022, our bill passed. So that's all it took.
So I guess since that is like the last decade of your work, and tell us, what was the problem? What were you trying to solve? How did you solve it?
Sure. I guess even before I was involved, there was a lot of issues around, let me think where to start. So Alaska's state statutes that regulate alcohol control, Title IV, Alaska statutes, Title IV, is what controls everything from the licensing system to, rules about underage drinking, penalties like that. Our local options system, which is what we would call dry, damp villages, not just villages, but communities, and a bunch of other different laws around alcohol. So not things like DUI, those are in the criminal code, but anything around regulation of the alcohol industry.
And like licenses, you mean like a liquor license for an establishment?
Yes. Yeah. So bars, package stores, that kind of thing. So, and then the entity that regulates those things and implements the actual statutes is the Alaska Alcohol Beverage Control Board, the ABC board. And then they're supported by the Alcohol and Marijuana Control Office, used to just be called the ABC office, and that's at the state under the Department of Commerce. And so it's a regulatory board. They do issue licenses. They can't take action against licenses. And there's obviously a lot of different groups who are impacted by alcohol. So on the business side, there's the alcohol industry, everyone from those retailers to brewers, distillers, wholesalers, the people who distribute alcohol. There's local governments, they're interested in growing their economy, and they also deal with a lot of the impacts of alcohol, local police, those kinds of things. Everybody's heard about the problem liquor store or the problem bar. That's often at the local level. And then it flows up to the state level. And then there's also health folks, people who are concerned about consumption of alcohol, about the harms of misuse of alcohol, for everything from underage drinking. It's not good for a kid's brain to drink under a certain age, all the way up to, binge drinking, and then the harms of alcohol, excessive alcohol use, which can include, cancer, stroke, cirrhosis of the liver, all kinds of different things. And then certainly mental health and related impacts. There's also law enforcement and public safety. All kinds of different entities are concerned about alcohol use from one way or another, or concerned about or interested in. And there's also, competition issues. So for example, it's not just in Alaska, but there's been an issue where there's the growth of craft brewing and this idea of having a bar or a beer at your brewery instead of going to a bar. And so there's often kind of conflict over market share, right? So bars maybe see a brewery as competition or taking away their customers or.
Right. And I mean, again, not an expert here, but isn't there a rule like breweries had to close at like 8 or something, and then you would have to go to a bar, or there was like a time like where certain things had to close by a certain time, and but bars could stay open? I mean, I don't know. Did I get that wrong?
No, that's correct. Because I think, and that really is just one example of where, again, historically, the law can be used to either shut your competition out or regulate your competition. And then it can come down to, who has the best lobbyists, for example. And so that was certainly an issue in our statutes.
Who had better lobbyists? The breweries or the bars? I mean,
certainly for years, the bar industry. And partly because, the breweries...
There was more of them.
Yeah, there's more of them. A lot of the breweries are newer. And then, I don't know in terms of scale, in terms of funding, but you got to put money in the pot to pay for the advocacy. And so, And there's a lot of different interests too. I mean, there's kind of locally owned bars. There's the cruise ships in the big hospitality industry. So there's really different complex interests within that industry that are interesting to unpack.
You've done a very good job of explaining how complicated this issue is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And the other issue that I'm tracking that you worked on there was with Anchored Home. I know housing and homelessness have been very much in the news in Anchorage for last year and a half, or longer actually, but for a while now, it's been very much front and center. Can you talk about Anchored Home, what you did on it and what that looks like today?
Sure. And I should say too, it's, so I work for a consulting firm, and so we work on contract. And so we've been involved in a variety of different ways. I haven't actually worked on it since last year, I believe.
Well, for those who may not know, what is Anchored Home?
So Anchored Home is, it was adopted in 2018, and it was really a community plan that both the municipality, meaning it was former Mayor Berkowitz, and then the Anchorage Assembly later adopted it as well. So it's really a community-driven plan to address homelessness. And the intent of it, the vision is to make homelessness a rare, brief, and one-time experience. So the idea is to really talk about the fact that there are a lot of causes for homelessness, everything from, losing your job and then losing your house or your apartment, to having difficulty keeping a job because you have maybe untreated mental health issues, or maybe you have a medical emergency, or, there's a wide variety of reasons why someone ends up in that place. And so it's really trying to define a system that's beyond shelter. So for example, you could build a whole bunch of shelters in town, or one giant shelter, or whatever you're going to build, and that's not going to put anybody in housing. That's not going to solve the problem. It's going to have a hopefully safe place to sleep for those folks for that night, right? Or in perpetuity. So to really address, and people say homelessness is really the end result of all the system failures that happened before that. So the healthcare system, issues in our economy, issues in our education, so like all of those things, historical trauma, racism and discrimination, like all of those things are factors which can lead to someone becoming or experiencing homelessness. And so the work was really to get the city's hands around it. So not just the municipality, not just the city government, but everybody. So everybody from healthcare providers, current shelter providers, housing providers, like everybody. How can we design our system better? And so the idea is to really have a variety, and this is kind of laid out in Anchored Home, having a variety of options for people. So recognizing not population should not just be all put together, but there's people, LGBTQ people, women, domestic violence survivors, different populations, and they have different needs, because you might have a family who, like I said, maybe they got divorced, and maybe they don't have not even a down payment for the house. Maybe they don't have a security deposit to move into an apartment, because all of a sudden they have one income and not two. And so they may be living in their car or something like that. And so what they need is really some financial support and short-term stability, so that they can go back to, living the life that they were living, essentially, maybe finding a new job. And then that's kind of one part of the spectrum. Another one would be a youth, somebody who maybe they came out as trans, and then their family was not accepting and put them out on the street. And so if they have family members, that's great, and they can accept them back in. A lot of people don't, and so they're on the street, and then they're very vulnerable. And then folks who maybe have been on the street for a long time, or like I said, have untreated other issues, or being unsheltered on the street is in itself, it has mental health effects, right? Like it's demonstrated to make somebody's mental health deteriorate over time. And so it's not so much that maybe they started out with the severity of condition that they have now, but that's the result of what they did. So Anchored Home was really saying, how do we design a system that is efficient, that gets as few people as possible into shelter and as many people as possible into housing. And the key was on housing, because that's where you stabilize. That's the whole idea of housing first. And so it's unfortunate in Anchorage, the first project here, Carlick Manor, was really, it's led people to conflate housing first with what they call wet housing, or allowing somebody to still use alcohol or drugs in their housing unit. But really the whole concept of it is just saying you need to get somebody in a home, in a house, in a housing unit before they can do anything else. So if you want them to go to treatment and become, get sober, they're not going to do that if they're on the street, not only because they're unprotected, they don't have their basic needs met, and then maybe are going to be a victim of violence even, but also because if you're on the street, a lot of people, and people describe it this way, you get sucked back into that culture, right? Of like, so if you're trying to stay sober and then all of your friends are out drinking and just sitting out on the pavement, how are you supposed to say no, right? Where are you going to go? Are you sit across the street, I guess, and just look at them? So it's very much, it's like they say when people are trying to quit smoking, it's really hard. If you go outside, you're trying to quit. I haven't been a smoker myself, but you go outside and you start smelling that cigarette smoke, and everybody's
your spouse smokes, for example.
Exactly. Yeah. Those triggers. And so that's where, it's unrealistic to expect people to be able to achieve these other outcomes, like getting sober, like being able to, get their mental health issues under control, keeping their medications or staying on medication, those kind of things, if they don't have a place to live. And again, shelter is good because it keeps people off the street. It keeps people out of places like Centennial Park or our other public places in the winter. But it's not as safe, and it's not the same as a house, and it's not, often you have to leave at 8 a.m. right? So I mean, just the idea that you can stay in this one room that you are allowed to be in, that is your room for 24 hours a day, obviously not staying all the time, but like that's what housing is, right? It's having a place for your stuff. It's knowing where the address is, even if it's a PO box. It's just having a place that's yours that you can also keep others out if you need to. Mm-hmm. So it keeps you safe.
Do you have a book that you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
Oh man. Well, I'd say I'm going to do a callback to your prior podcast and say Politics is for Power, Eaton Hirsch, because I'm looking at it right now. But so I guess that's one, because I really enjoyed that book, and a lot of things resonated for me, especially that focus on local, to say, building local relationships and building local power is awesome. And
yeah, I'll just say that I read that book while I was deployed to Kosovo. And I remember thinking, man, I really need to get more involved in local politics. And I came home and I did. And I mean, it became so all-consuming that now when people talk to me about national politics, I really don't know what they're talking about. It's just like such a shocking thing that for so many years, I just watched the national news and I just paid attention to what was happening in Washington. And man, that has really changed.
Yeah. I'm
all Anchorage all the time.
Yeah.
Like you, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, you're probably not as much as me, but you are, kind of.
Yeah. No, I've been involved in a lot of things, and I don't know. I guess that it goes back to the cities. Like, this is the place that we live, and like, why not make it awesome?
Anna Brawley, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you to Corey Coolidge for making this podcast listenable. Please check out his website, anchoragelife.net, and his YouTube channel by the same name, about life here in Anchorage. Thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. In a week, we are discussing A Land Gone Lonesome by Fairbanks-based author Dan O'Neill. It's about the Yukon River and the people who live on it. You still have time to read it before the episode.